Rabbi Bruce Kahn. For this, Rabbi Bruce Kahn is Rabbi Emeritus at Temple Shalom, where he served as its rabbi from 1980 to 1988, and as its senior rabbi from 1988 to 2001. He was ordained from Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in 1974. He spent the next 2 years on active duty as a U.S. Navy chaplain. He then continued his military career in the Navy's Ready Reserve Force, while he accepted the pulpit of Congregation or AMI in Richmond, Virginia, before coming to Shalom in 1980. Bruce Kahn worked with Temple Shalom's leadership to establish the Mitzvah Corps. Very cool. And if I mispronounce this, forgive me. The Madrichim?
Close. Pretty good.
Okay. Program, the Sharvura, expansion, numerous advances in our social justice, members, groups of members, and the congregation in its entirety. Use our faith and use their faith to move towards wholeness of being. So please welcome Rabbi Bruce Kahn.
Thank you.
Would you like to use this? Okay.
So it's great to be with you. As I was thinking about what I might say tonight, I took the name of the organization here to heart and thought about three Turkish men who had a huge impact on my life along the way. The first was a high school teacher of mine who I think was a technical advisor for the movie Istanbul, and rumor had it was once engaged to Ava Gabor. I don't know if that's true. One of the most debonair people I ever met, and his name, he was Muslim, and his name is Sanap Karatli. And I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but that's what we all thought his name was. And then I had the greatest pedagogue that I ever had as a professor was Chacham Yitzchak Yerushalmi, who was Turkish. And he is somebody who was so great as a teacher, he could make Aramaic grammar sexy. And also someone I went to school with who was just brilliant and insightful and really helpful to me in terms of understanding the world much better. And his name is Rifat Sansino. So those are just three Turks that I've met along the way who had each one had a profound positive influence on my life. Shalom.
Shalom.
The Hebrew word for peace, shalom, gets right to the whole point of the topic this evening. Indeed, I think the meaning of shalom gets right to the point of human existence altogether, in all Abrahamic faiths and others as well. Shalom comes from the Hebrew word for wholeness, shalemut. The pursuit of wholeness is what everyone in this room engages in and day out. Living so as to merit eternal wholeness or perfected being is a familiar concept to each faith. The question is how, as we pursue wholeness of being for ourselves, can we simultaneously protect the opportunity of others to do the same, particularly when it comes to protecting their religious freedom and minority rights. I am a rabbi, so I begin to answer this question by consulting Jewish texts. In the first chapters of Genesis, we read two stories, sacred myths, that claim we are all created in God's image and all descended from a couple, Adam and Eve. That idea should humble us and lead us in our own time to unhesitatingly uphold the dignity and freedom of members of different faiths and ethnicities, especially minorities in our midst. The biblical book of Leviticus, chapter 19, verse 18 commands, Va'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your fellow as yourself. In the book of Exodus 23:9 appears this requirement, V'ger lo tilchatz, va'atem yadatem et nefesh hager, ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim. You shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the feelings of the stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt. And in case one is still not convinced to safeguard religious freedom and minority rights, we find the following teaching from Deuteronomy 24:17, Lo tatem mishpat ger, you shall not subvert the rights of the stranger. In some, the Torah teaches, as we read in Deuteronomy 16:20, tzedek tzedek tirdof, justice, justice, you shall pursue. It does not end there. In the prophetic book titled Micah, chapter 6, come these goals. Thus he will judge among many peoples and arbitrate for the multitude of nations, however distant. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not take up sword against nation. They shall never again know war. Every man shall sit under his grapevine or fig tree with no one to disturb him. From Psalm 133, verse 1, we get a sense of where all this mutual respect is supposed to lead. Hine matovu manayim shevet achim gam yachad. How good and how pleasant it is for us to dwell together in unity. In our rabbinic tradition, it is easy to find unequivocal support for these biblical values. From Mishnah Avot, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? And this maxim, let the honor of another be as precious to you as your own. From the book of Sanhedrin in the Talmud, we find one person was created as the common ancestor of all for the sake of the peace of the human race, so that one should not be able to say to another, my ancestor was better than yours. And also from Talmud Sanhedrin, this teaching familiar as well to Muslims. One person was created to teach us the sanctity and importance of every life. For he who destroys one life, it is as if he destroys an entire world. And he who saves one life, it is as if he saves an entire world. I would venture to make an educated guess that there exist thousands and thousands of statements in Jewish sources demanding protection of minority rights and granting religious freedom to those individuals outside the Jewish community. But to begin to grasp the power of those statements, one has to factor in the impact of Jewish history, during which so often and in so many places the rights of Jews were denied, abrogated, decimated. We begin with the story of Hanukkah and the Syrian-Greek attempt to wipe out the Jewish faith. We continue with the conquest of Judea by Roman emperors and their legions, the sacking of Jerusalem, the expulsion of Jews from our homeland. During the Middle Ages in Europe and elsewhere, we faced restrictions on where we could live, requirements that forced us to dress so that we stood out, limited opportunities to work, having to pay extra taxes, our books being burned, official persecutions, slaughter, rape, forced conversions, destruction of our holy places, enslavement. And then in our own time came the Holocaust and numerous other persecutions. Over the millennia, we were blamed for killing Jesus and for poisoning the prophet Muhammad, blamed for the Black Plague and all sorts of other calamities. Even in the minds of some people, we were held responsible for 9/11. For 2,000 years, we Jews have had far more experience than we would wish to have with the denial of religious freedom and minority rights. Why? We were and are different. Everywhere except in Israel, we were and are a tiny religious minority. Our very existence is a statement that we do not share some of the same central beliefs affirmed massively by massively larger religious communities. We are different, and so often that means we are deemed unworthy, even not human. Due to time constraints, let me skip the need for a well-developed segue and with a jolt start to mention what many of you may already be thinking. If what I have said is true, how do I then account for the disturbing parts in the record of some of Israel's policies and practices aimed at Arabs in general and Palestinians in particular? I am the last person who will attempt to run from or whitewash violations of civil rights and human rights taking place in Israel and the occupied territories every day. They must be faced and stopped, and I work to do so, but there is more to the story. By more, I could mean all the amazing accomplishments of Israel, especially in research and development in medicine, agriculture, technology, and so on. These advances are indeed stunning. But that won't help this discussion. I will instead mention all the efforts even right-wing regimes make every day to protect the holy places of other religions, to provide non-Jews with voting rights, medical care, education, religious freedom, even representation in the Knesset. I will mention as well private nonprofit organizations there, such as the Israel-Palestine Center for Research and Information, the human rights group B'Tselem, the cooperative Jewish-Arab village Neve Shalom Wahad Salam, the Interreligious Coordinating Council in Israel, and Rabbis for Human Rights. I could go on and on. Dozens of organizations exist that take the teachings that I mentioned at the start of this talk very much to heart. I don't know how many such organizations exist among Israel's neighbors. My point is that within the Jewish world, the existence of these agencies working constantly and hard for minority rights would be a surprise to no Jew. I think when faced with the existence of all these efforts in Israel, most Jews would simply shrug and say, of course. And the record of Jewish leadership when it comes to protecting and expanding religious freedom and minority rights in this country is simply breathtaking. If you are unfamiliar with it, please check it out. I want to close by mentioning an unsettling struggle for freedom of religion and minority rights taking place right now in the United States. In November 2014, I was the only rabbi in the country called to testify before Congress with regard to the status of religious accommodation in the U.S. Armed Forces. The hearing was conducted by the Military Personnel Subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee. In this evening's question and answer period, if you wish, we can discuss this struggle further. But let me just take a few seconds to say now that there is a worrisome alliance growing among three groups of religious and political conservatives. Political and religious conservatives on the Hill, allied with lobbyists from political and religious conservative organizations, allied with increasing numbers of political and religiously conservative members of the military, including chaplains, much to my chagrin. I consider the situation dire and getting more so, and I see it as a reflection of intolerance growing in America today. I'll be happy to try to answer any questions you may have with me in a little while. I thank you for inviting me to participate on this panel. I end with the same word with which I began, shalom.
So that was causing a bit of disturbance, so we decided to forego the buzzing sound of the microphone. I actually, a few months ago, had the opportunity to visit the Air Force Academy, and I had the opportunity to visit the chapel, and it was beautiful. The chapel is, I'm guessing you've been there.
Yeah, it's a, well, they have the three, you know, for the,
They have a Buddhist.
yeah. Oh, they have a
Temple,
Buddhist now.
yep,
They didn't when I was there.
And it's right next to the space for the Jewish community.
Yeah.
And
Unfortunately, the Air Force Academy is one of the primary places where the assault on religious accommodation in the military is taking place.
it's unfortunate because it
Yes.
didn't seem to be so.
Yes.
Given that structure, it seemed.
Appearances may be deceiving.
Yes, apparently. And we can talk about more of that later, but definitely.
Yeah.
Now I would like to introduce our Christian speaker, Reverend Dr. Larry Buxton. And he has been the senior pastor at pardon me?
Burke.
Thank you, Burke, just Burke. Okay, just Burke, okay. At Burke since 2007, he is a graduate of the University of Virginia and Yale Divinity School, Wesley Theological Seminary. Larry served for years on the Virginia Conference Board of Ordained Ministry and remains active on the Alexandria District Committee on Ordained Ministry. He teaches the practice of preaching at the summer course of study school at Wesley Theological Seminary. Larry is also a board-certified coach, BCC, and a member of the International Coaching Federation, ICF, the standard professional organization for personal and professional coaching. Please welcome him.
I was privileged to have a very wonderful perspective as Bruce was talking, because I was sitting over here looking this way, and one was I just enjoyed what he had to say, and the other was the backdrop of where he was speaking. One of the high spots of my year this past year was the privilege of being in Istanbul and in Turkey with Imam Bilal and Kaya, and one of the stories I told my congregation was the time when we were invited, somehow this was set up, and we were invited into the home of a family in Turkey who I discovered later had not only never had a Christian person in their home, but had never met or spoken with a Christian person. And through translations, we had a chance to talk about, some of our stereotypes and images of Americans, of Christians, of Muslims as well. And two things he did that just so affected me. One was, of course, we came, I say we, there were maybe a dozen of us on the trip, and we came over knowing that the overwhelming amount of media coverage of Muslims in the United States is, of course, terrorism. And we were just talking about this, and I will always remember how he just picked at his clothes in disgust and anger that this whole notion of intolerant terrorism was being laid upon the religion and the God that he loved so much. And it was visibly paining him to know that there were other people in the world who, as we confessed our ignorance, we said, but if you ask what the images are, of Turkish people or of Muslims, that's what it is. And at the end, he was so grateful that we had come, and he embraced us, and he really was very tearful. And the notion of our being one Abrahamic people was so strong with him that he embraced me, and he said, Moses and Jesus. And as he was letting me go, I said, Muhammad. And then he grabbed me all the more and squeezed me tighter. But it was one of those powerful moments that if we're blessed, we get a chance to experience. And I'm grateful to Bilal, to my friend Mehmet, to the people of Ezra Bloom and others who have begun to introduce me to this community and to this kind of time to be together with you. I confess that I had real trouble coming to grips with the topic of minority rights and religious freedoms. And am I saying that right? I asked a couple times, like, help me make sure I understand this, because it's not a phrase that we use very often as we're talking about our faith. Minority rights and religious freedoms within Christianity, maybe because it doesn't speak so well to how our faith is organized, that I thought it may be easier for Judaism or for Catholicism if they have governing bodies in Rome or in Jerusalem that make some decisions about what's orthodox and what isn't. But in my branch of Christianity, which is Protestantism, minorities don't stay minorities for very long. If we find ourselves being a minority and we don't like it, we just leave and start our own. So I wanted, if I could, to beg your indulgence, and let's do 2,000 years in about 4 minutes and see how that comes up. You may know that the Christian church began as a breakaway sect of Judaism, that it maintained itself as a minority movement within Judaism for about 20 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. And Paul of Tarsus of course being in Turkey, discovered that non-Jewish people were having the same direct experience of Jesus, of a risen Jesus, as anyone else, so that he argued that what God was doing in Jesus completely transcended the structures of Judaism. And so one did not need to be within the structures of Judaism in order to have the experience of a living Christ. So by the end of the 1st century, that split between the early church and Judaism was pretty clear. And it was the metaphor I kept using as I was thinking and writing about this. I look out on my back window, and there are woods out there. And so I started thinking about woods and trees and leaves because it was right in front of me. And it was as though a branch was broken off and separated from the tree of Judaism, planted in the ground, began to form new roots, and began to develop as its own tree, if you will. So for about 2 500-year periods, for 1,000 years, from the Christian perspective, there was only that one tree. There was only one tree. It had become very large. It was what we call the Catholic tree, and Catholic with a small c, as you know, simply means universal. So that was the church that we were, and that church had grown and flourished for about 1,000 years in different climates and different distinctions and varieties. That tree was the main tree. It was on a Saturday afternoon of July the 16th, 1054, when afternoon prayers were about to begin in the Hagia Sophia, which also happens to be here. Saturday afternoon prayers were about to begin, and a man named Cardinal Humbert, who was a representative of Pope Leo IX, went into the cathedral and laid down on the main altar a parchment declaring that the Patriarch of Constantinople, who was Michael Cerularius, was excommunicated. And he declared that on the altar of the temple before the beginning of prayers, walked out and immediately left the city. About a week later, bless you, a week later the Patriarch condemned the Cardinal, and off, and running, that sort of stuff went. But that really kind of was a decisive moment in a long series of events that was another breakaway. The other breakaway was that what we call the Great Schism was a breakaway from the Catholic Church, where a branch was separated and replanted, and that branch of the church became known as the Eastern Orthodox Church. That has, as you know, sprouted into the Russian Orthodox and the Bulgarian Orthodox and Turkish Orthodox and so on and so forth. But now there begin to be kind of two trees. One clarifies its existence now by calling itself the Roman Catholic Church, and the other is the Eastern Orthodox Church. So those two trees pretty much take up the ground for another 500 years. Until, or in the 1500s, Martin Luther, who is a Roman Catholic priest in Germany, comes to the conviction that the Roman Catholic tree has grown corrupt and diseased over its 1,500 years of existence. He protested against the poor cultivation, the neglect, the abuse of the Roman Catholic tree. And on another dramatic date, this was Friday, these things seem to happen on weekends for some reason. On Friday afternoon, October the 31st, 1517, Luther posted his 95 disagreements with the Roman Catholic Church on the door of the cathedral in Wittenberg, Germany. Because this was a protest movement, he was leading a group of protesters who were Protestants, and from that comes our branch, the Protestant Church. So our origin begins in protest of the larger church. But Luther does an interesting thing. He, in essence, not only splits the branch from the Roman Catholic tree and plants it in Germany, but he intentionally does not want to plant another main tree. Its root system does not go down so deeply, but rather it grows this way. It grows horizontally instead of vertically. In our backyard, where there are woods, we have oak trees, we have a cherry tree, we have a Japanese maple tree, and every fall when I rake leaves, which I'm growing each year to detest more and more, I'll rake up, oak leaves and leaves from the Japanese maple tree, and I know that they all come from a single discrete tree, and that's what grows in our backyard. But we also have something in our backyard called Virginia creeper. Are you familiar, anybody, with Virginia creeper? Virginia creeper grows that way. It sends out tendrils and stems and vines that as they grow horizontally, then they anchor themselves in a place, and a section of root comes out of that anchoring. But then it spreads further and keeps doing the same thing. So it goes horizontally. And you have to pull this thing up and track it for yards and yards if a Virginia creeper is well grown, because that's how it becomes established. Not by going down so much, but by going everywhere else fast. So I think that's the image for Christianity today, that it's rare for a church to remain a minority for very long, because, if you'll pardon the expression, it just leaves. It just leaves when it's struggling with its minority status. Things stayed stable for the next 500 years until this day and age, and now, as we understand what's happening in religion, it's happening again, at least over the past 2 generations, not only within Protestant Christianity, not only in all of Christianity, but probably in ways that affect all of our faith traditions as well. This sense of upheaval and change is coming through our whole culture, perhaps our whole world over and again. In my offshoot tradition, our fear is that it's about ready to happen again. And by that I mean I don't think there'll be a day that will have the same major impact as July the 16th, 1054, or October the 31st, 1517. But there will, I believe, come a day, not out of the blue, a day that's been long in the works and that will happen, and that there will be long aftershocks where we'll see another split again. Our Methodist Church is working very hard to make sure that does not happen. But for us, something soon will have to give, because we've been at a point where the status quo is not sustainable. And what I mean by that is this. There has, as we all know, been a rising tide, especially in Western society and Western churches, to lift the rights of gays and lesbians as a human rights issue. And Christian churches have been facing these type of issues for years. I know tonight, as we gather, we're probably all across the spectrum on that particular question. From some of us who find it a passionate issue, to some of us finding it simply incomprehensible that that's an issue being debated in our faith traditions. But in the spring of 1972, when our United Methodist Worldwide group was meeting together, there was 2 simple statements that were inserted into the Methodist Statement of Beliefs that said, first, we believe that all persons are individuals of sacred worth, created in the image of God. And secondly, it said the United Methodist Church does not condone the practice of homosexuality and considers this practice incompatible with Christian teaching. Now, those words have been debated and qualified and challenged and disobeyed for the last 44 years, but have never been removed. And there are people who feel like those statements, those words do not belong in a listing of our basic beliefs. That group has been a minority, a religious minority within United Methodism since 1972. In recent years, we get the same thing that we're seeing in our country. More polarization, more difficulty in talking and listening to each other around this issue. We've seen other Protestant denominations split and divide over this very same issue. And so many of us are filled with hope and prayer and some concern because the worldwide gathering of Methodists will be next month, May the 10th through the 20th in Portland, Oregon. And I bring that up simply because this is the closest I think this particular topic gets to where I come from in terms of religious freedom and minority rights. And as I said, our tradition has been that we don't normally stay minorities very long before somebody breaks away and leaves. That we don't always have the loyalty that we should be Methodist first or Protestant first or Christian first, and then struggle with minority status. That doesn't happen too long before we take a shoot and plant it somewhere else and watch it grow again. But lastly, what I think is important about this issue is that it raises for us 4 questions that I think are incredibly important for all of us. The first question it raises is, what's the nature of God's revelation? What's the nature of God's revelation? Are we given new insight that comes to us still from a living God, or does the tradition always win? Does the way the tradition has been understood always trump everything else? Second question, how do we interpret the Bible? How do we interpret our scriptures? Most of us have been long past the day where everybody sees it the same way, where now we have alternate interpretations that live side by side. But how far apart can those alternate interpretations be? Is there a limit beyond which people say, we're too far apart, we don't belong under the same umbrella? The third is our relationship with the culture. We struggle with, and I'm sure we all do in our own ways, when is the church supposed to resist what's happening in the culture? When is the church supposed to change and understand the changes that happen in the culture? How do we remain faithful and relevant at the same time? And the fourth is, what's the nature of people who disagree with us? On this issue especially, is it that some people want to avoid the sacrifice and the discipline of celibacy, for example, and are just looking for the easy way out by asking God's blessing upon this change? Or is this a matter of standing up for ourselves and claiming God's blessing in a way that our culture and our church has not seen happen before? And I think those are crucial matters of faith for all of us, because those are the 4 things that also have implications for how we discuss Islam and Christianity and Judaism among ourselves together. Those same 4 things are, what's the nature of God's revelation? Is that fixed, or does that continue to come to us? There are different ways to interpret Scripture. How far apart can we be? How close and unified must we be? What's our relationship with the surrounding culture? What does it mean to be a person of faith in 2016 and beyond? And lastly, most importantly, how do we regard the people that we disagree with? How do we regard and listen to people whose points of view are different from our own? And lastly, that just raises bigger, deeper questions for us. When is a minority asked to be a minority with humility? When is it appropriate for a minority within a majority to accept that? Theologically, it's dangerous for us to say, our ancestors had this all wrong. But when is it more important to stand firm as well, to say there is precedent where we believe our ancestors were wrong in matters of race or in matters of slavery? not to compare them, but to acknowledge that there are times when our traditions lead us in other ways. When is our unity more important than our diversity? Or when is principle and standing for principle more important than harmony? Is it more important that we stay together but we disagree, or is it more important to be honest and consistent if that causes us to splinter and destroy our unity? Does our strength come from speaking in only one voice? Is it more important that we speak together as a voice and we dilute our strength by our diversity? Or, if we speak with many voices, maybe there are more people who will hear the basic message of Judaism or Islam or Christianity, and to know there's room in those faith traditions for a lot of different people. So that's my botany, forest, and woods analogy. How far can minority positions and diversity bend our trees before they snap? And are trees of our tradition capable of more flexibility than we might want them to be? And I think those are questions without answer, but I think they're also the questions that are defining our generation as we struggle with this issue today. Thank you very much.
Well, some really important questions, and got us all thinking, I think. So leave some time for some Q&A, definitely, to answer hopefully some of them. Our final speaker, our Muslim speaker, is Rabia Chaudhry. She is a wife and a mother. She's an attorney, and recently the Jennings Randolph Senior Fellow at USIP, the U.S. Institute of Peace. President of the Safe Nation Collaborative, National Security Fellow at the New America Foundation, and a senior CVE consultant. As a civically engaged legal practitioner, Rabia has experience in immigration law, civil liberties, and national security. Her work with the New America Foundation focuses on the empowerment and inclusion of American Muslim communities in the national security realm. Her firm, Safe Nation Collaborative, works on two fronts, providing CVE and cultural competency training to law enforcement, correctional and homeland security officials, and providing national security and CVE training to Muslim communities, countering violent extremism. We all don't know this new acronym, and institutions. So she's doing so much more. Couldn't mention it all. Please welcome Rabia Chaudhry.
Good evening and Assalamu alaikum. Shalom, hello. When I was sitting up here and I got settled in for the panel, I kept thinking one of these things is not like the other. And it's not because I'm not a white male. That wasn't what I was thinking. What I was thinking is we have two religious leaders here. And I am not a religious leader. I am not a religious scholar. I don't lead a congregation. And so when I was asked to come and speak about minority rights and religious freedom, I'm coming at it from a very different perspective. So what are some of the perspectives that I'm coming at this from? I am an attorney. I've been licensed for, 15, 16 years. So of course I'm going to look at this from a legal perspective. I'm a person of faith, so I draw authority and wisdom from my faith tradition. I'm an American. I have American values, but I was born in Pakistan. So I know some of the cultural baggage that comes along with that, and I know what that country is experiencing. As a Muslim, I'm connected to a global Muslim ummah, a community. And I also know what these issues look like in different Muslim populations across the world. And this is an issue I think about a lot. I think about it a lot for a couple of different reasons. I think about it in the context of when Muslims are minorities, and I think about it in the context of when Muslims are not minorities and they're majorities. So I don't have to tell you what the Constitution of the United States says about religious freedom and says about minority rights, right? I mean, the Constitution is clear on religious freedom. Our commitment to religious freedom is an American value. And it's very interesting if you compare the kind of separation of church and state in the United States to the kind of secularism you see in Europe. They look very different. In America, the value is freedom of religion. Whereas I think in Europe it's mostly freedom from religion. And people are much less comfortable with religion. Americans overwhelmingly, I think almost 70% in polls, say that they are religious people. That is a lot of people who think that they have some connection to religion, God, spirituality. Almost, I think 70% was the number. So it's important to me that we maintain, and I want to connect this. I know we don't have a lot of time. We only have like 5 minutes, but I'm going to try to squeeze in as much as I can. Keeping, you know, the First Amendment is important to keep that in mind, because I'm going to connect it to kind of what's happening in the social political landscape of the United States today. But then, okay, I'm a Muslim, right? So I have a faith tradition. What does my faith say about religion and minority rights? It actually speaks very directly to religion, very directly to the protection of religious minorities. And I'm actually going to read from a manuscript that was issued by the Prophet Muhammad himself to a monastery, St. Catherine's Monastery, located in Mount Sinai. I think to this day it stands. Monks from this monastery went to the Prophet when Muslims actually began controlling that part of the land and said, we're worried. You know, we're monks, we're a monastery, what does this mean for our religious protection? And this is, I'm just going to read it, it's very brief, the letter that he issued to them. He said, this is a message from Muhammad ibn Abdullah as a covenant to those who adopt Christianity. Near and far, we are with them. Verily I, the servants, the helpers, and my followers defend them, because Christians are my citizens. And by Allah, I hold out against anything that displeases them. No compulsion is to be on them, neither are their judges to be removed from their jobs or their monks from their monasteries. No one is to destroy a house of their religion, or damage it, or to carry anything from it to the Muslims' houses. Should anyone take any of these, he would spoil God's covenant and disobey his prophet. Verily they are my allies, and have my secure charter against all that they hate. No one is to force them to travel or oblige them to fight. The Muslims are to fight for them. If a female Christian is married to a Muslim, it's not to take place without her approval. She's not to be prevented from visiting her church to pray. Their churches are to be respected. They're neither to be prevented from repairing them or the sacredness of their covenants. No one of the nation of Muslims is to disobey this covenant until the last day, meaning the day of judgment. In a separate hadith, which is a tradition of the Prophet, he also said that on the day of judgment, those Muslims who oppress minorities, Christians in their communities, I will be standing witness against those Muslims. Okay. So it's very, very clear, right? It's very clear. It's both clear in our tradition, what is expected from Muslims towards religious minorities. It's clear from the Constitution. The problem is, it's not connecting on the ground, right? My family comes from Pakistan. We have blasphemy laws. I spent years representing minorities, religious minorities from Pakistan, from Afghanistan, whether they were Christian, Sikh, Hindu, Ahmadi Muslim, Shia, as they filed for asylum in the United States, because they don't have a lot of protection in Pakistan. You know, we know what the state of minority protections in many, many Muslim countries is like. That doesn't mean it's like that everywhere, but it's definitely something, as a Muslim, I feel like I have a covenant. We have a covenant we have to keep. We're breaking that covenant. At the same time, I'm going to call on my Christian and Jewish friends in this country and say, what about your covenants? How does your faith translate to action when we have presidential candidates who openly debate the merits of having a Muslim in their cabinet? I would not appoint a Muslim in my cabinet. 2 or 3 weeks ago, Donald Trump was asked, would he consider internment camps for Muslims? Just think about this question. What are we talking about here? What is happening here? I have 2 daughters I'm raising in this country. Should I continue to raise them in this country? It breaks my heart. I have a daughter who's 18, I have a daughter who's 7. The only thing they've seen is post-9/11 anti-Muslim rhetoric. That is their country. That is how their country is treating them as Muslims. I don't put the blame totally on, on conservative politics. There's plenty of liberal apathy that has led us this far. We have gotten to a point where we are completely tolerant of horrible, horrible hate speech against Muslims by politicians, by the highest offices of the land, hearings that are held in Congress, about Muslim radicalization. I have worked on these issues for years. And so I would say that if you're talking about, the protection of religious minorities, guess what? Muslims are a religious minority in this country. There should be no tolerance. I believe in freedom of speech just as much as I believe in freedom of religion. But we have to be able to recognize when free speech is hate speech. If there was a discussion on MSNBC about whether Jews should be put in internment camps, what would happen? If black people should be put in internment camps, what would happen? Why are we tolerating this? This is not the country that I grew up in. It's also not the story that I come from. You know, my father, when he came to this country, he's a Pakistani Muslim, his Pakistani Christian best friend sponsored him. The first person to give him a job was an elderly Jewish veterinarian who said, take over my clinic, and I'm going to give you a house so your wife and infant daughter can live there. My entire life has been one of existing in friendship and love with people of other faiths. And all of a sudden, this is not I don't recognize this country anymore. And I'm calling on our Jewish and Christian partners to call out the hate speech and not let it go. It is and I also think that what's happening is that people aren't even, it's become so normalized, they're not even noticing it. Nobody's even noticing it, nobody's blinking, because it's like this, I had a friend who was visiting me from Australia last week. And she said that she was here during some of the GOP debates, and she was horrified. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. And she said, you know what, Rabia? She said, what you guys don't understand is that you Muslims have been you're like a frog in a pot of water that's been on a slow boil. It's like slowly, slowly, slowly. You don't even realize you're being cooked alive. And I think she's right. I think we didn't realize it. We kept letting it go. We kept letting it go. We're like, oh, it'll get better. It's just getting worse. And this really frightens me. The polarization here frightens me. It frightens me in Pakistan. It frightens me in Saudi Arabia. It frightens me in Israel. I'm a fellow of the Shalom Hartman Institute. I studied in Israel. Okay. I think it's important to be balanced on these issues. I will defend what's good in Pakistan. I will call out what's wrong because I connect with those people. They're my people. I say American Jews have to do the same. They have to do the same. So if we are people of faith and we are leaders in our communities, we shouldn't be shy of recognizing where we are feeling the minorities under our protection. And also, when we are also minorities, obviously we have to continue to fight for that. So I'm going to just wrap up there because I think I'm over time now. It's 8:01. All right, I'll take questions. Thank you. And I'm an activist, if nobody caught that. Okay. Yes, please.
I have a question
Yes.
for Bruce. I'm from Portland, Oregon. Is
Hi.
it? Larry, welcome to Portland. Soon. One of my favorite great nephews recently got into West Point. And I'm wondering if you could give me some advice about how to alert him about what might be happening in the military regarding religious freedom.
So there's a big divide among military leaders and among military chaplains, and it kind of goes like this. And both sides are calling for, we're calling for religious freedom. Each side is saying the same thing. And here's how it breaks down. A very strongly evangelical Christian chaplain is going to take care of individual troops. In the military, chaplain takes care of everybody, right? Everybody knows that. Do you all know that? But this chaplain will only pray in the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost. So and when those of us including Christian chaplains, Jewish chaplains, Muslim chaplains, who believe that's not what the chaplaincy should be. The chaplain should minister to the individual person based on who that person is and where that person's coming from. So what's happened is that that since the early 90s, the dogma has built and become more and more rigid that Christian chaplains should pray according to their faith tradition, no matter who the individuals are that to whom they're providing ministry. The people on the other side, my side, say chaplain in the military adjusts what he says and does to meet the needs of the troops to whom he or she is providing ministry. And what's happened is that as certain conservative groups have gotten interested in this, and they have been lobbying Congress more and more to take the position that a chaplain should pray and talk and do according to his own faith tradition, no matter who the individual is. So your relative goes to West Point, and there they have a Jewish chaplain. And there's plenty of Jewish programming there. But after West Point, getting deployed, and there could only be one chaplain around, and if, God forbid, something happens to him, and he's wounded, and he wants a chaplain to minister to him, he's not going to want that chaplain to come over and pray in the name of Jesus Christ. He's going to want that chaplain to say something that's going to be useful, helpful, given who he is as a Jew. When I testified before the House Armed Services Committee, I said this, and I said, if you had I said to one representative in particular, if your son or daughter was wounded, would you want me to go over to that person, to your son or daughter, and pray a Misha Beirach for a Refuah Shalema, or would you want me to pray according to what would comfort and help your child? So this congressman said, it was Congressman Jones from North Carolina, and he said, let me ask all of you on the panel a question. Is it right or is it wrong for a chaplain to have the freedom to pray in his own faith tradition? Is that right or wrong? And I said, that's wrong. And he blew up and said that I was destroying the Constitution, changing America from what it's always been, and bringing on Armageddon. That's what he said to me. He screamed to the rooftops. So that's an issue. So when it comes to Muslims being cared for appropriately, Christians appropriately, Jews appropriately, Buddhists, Hindus, the unaffiliated, atheists, humanists, the chaplain should adjust according to who the people are to whom you're providing ministry. Increasingly, Congress, military leaders, and more chaplains don't see it that way. And I think that's a harbinger of what's happening in the country as a whole. And it's very scary, and it concerns me a lot.
I'll alert him.
I actually have a question for each of the speakers, and thank you. These were very insightful and thought-provoking talks. And my first one is just to follow up on what you just covered. And I'm wondering, one thing is the prayer and serving the wounded or the dying soldier. But is there another social or political objective behind this three-party coalition of conservatism? And if you can see those objectives, they may be shorter or long-term. For the second speaker, you said that there would be a moment of existential crisis for your community, and it's coming up, and I wonder what would be the causes behind this crisis and possibly separation of the community. And for the third speaker, being activist, and I happen to be one as well, I was wondering what should be our recipe then of not taking the attitude to Muslims in general, as it is not acceptable for the other faiths, and what should we do? What would be your recipe of mobilizing this community and the larger community to say that it isn't acceptable?
The quick answer is that for many of these folks, it's to have America finally say that, after all, it is a Christian country. So that's the short answer. And I've heard Jones say that off the Hill, speaking to a private group. I actually heard him say that.
The piece that pains me about that is I am reminded, and I do understand, that if want to make sure I say this well. If you are of another faith tradition or from another country, and you hear that 70% of people in the United States believe in God and they're somehow religious, that then we easily get tagged as being a Christian nation. And I understand there are folks in that particular wing, let's say, that have a view of what that means that's very different. Let me just say from mine. I'm not of that more right-wing Tea Party kind of thing, and I think there's some very un-Christian behavior that comes out of that out of their mouth. You know, similarly, I think, I don't know, I would like to think that all of us are equally repulsed by the intolerance of someone like Donald Trump, who in my mind has nothing to do with Christianity whatsoever. It amazes me that there are evangelical Christians who want to ally themselves with him or make him their candidate, when to me they are the ones that ought to be more repulsed than those whose commitment to Christianity is nominal. In a word, what I think is happening, I tried to say in our particular denomination, is in this case around the issue of homosexuality, whether our denomination will authorize or allow clergy to perform same-sex marriages, and if being a gay or lesbian is by itself enough to disqualify somebody from serving as a religious leader. And while on one hand, I don't personally think that's the issue that I wish we were going to go to the mat on, if I look at it broader and understand that it has some things to do with scriptural interpretation, with how wide can our fellowship be before it starts to strain and come apart and so on, then I think those are very key questions.
But isn't Methodism a little bit more on the liberal side as compared to the other
on where
strains
it
of
is.
Christianity?
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Yes, compared to some, and no compared to others. I always think the strength and the weakness of Methodism, I always say we're right in the middle of any two traditions, no matter who they are. At one point I was asked to do a wedding between a Vietnamese Buddhist woman and an evangelical Baptist man. And I said, how did you happen to come to me? And she said, well, you're kind of in the middle between us. That's an interesting place to be.
Okay, so, you know, I'll be honest, I think as somebody who's been an activist in the Muslim community since even before 9/11 and seeing the ramping up of Muslim activism, what really concerns me is right now anti-Muslim sentiment across all kinds of polls. I mean, I think in North Carolina, after the primary there, they polled GOP voters and about 69% said that Muslims should be banned from the country. So anti-Muslim sentiment is actually higher today than it was right after 9/11, which is crazy, right? You think like it couldn't get worse than that. It's gotten much worse because it's been politicized. It is funded, it is organized. There are all kinds of things happening behind the scenes that are making this happen. And it doesn't help us that we are engaged in a very prolonged military, you know, whatever, engagement overseas with all these Muslim majority countries. I don't care how many presidents say till they're blue in the face that we are not at a war against Islam. People still think we are, and Muslims over there also think we are. And I really feel like as long as that is the context of, you know, that we're living in, it's much like, you know, how during the Cold War, I mean, like, it's just, it is what it is. Muslims will be viewed with suspicion as an enemy until, you know, our global war on terror ends. Or we just disengage from it, or something of that sort. It's interesting, you're not going to find the same kind of anti-Western sentiment or anti-Muslim sentiment in countries, for example, like Canada. Why? It's because it's a different context politically and militarily. Now, so those are like real big meta issues. Now, on a smaller scale, what I would say is, I do encourage people to call out hate speech for what it is. It's a very simple calculation. If you had a GOP candidate who was saying the same things about Jews that they're saying about Muslims, would they be courted by MSNBC and CNN? Would they be invited to speak on these major platforms? Would they be invited to universities, to APAC? No, they wouldn't. They would not be invited. We wouldn't invite them in our small congregations. So we have to reject, we should not give platforms to people who are clear bigots, who are selling their bigotry for votes. And I think that, you know, at a minimum, fine. If they want to be ugly about and show us their ugliness and their bigotry, fine. But at least let's call it bigotry and hate speech. And I want to hear that happen in the mainstream media.
If I may have a follow-up, but don't you think that it is also a little bit a fault of this community of not calling the main networks and saying, hey, we just heard hate speech, can you do something about it? Would you please beep it? Not calling their congressmen, not calling their representatives and saying this is absolutely unacceptable. And why don't we organize this community to do this politically? I mean, that's the strength of minority communities in America.
Yeah.
So if we do not use it, yes, that's on us.
Right.
And at the same time, if we have this anti-Muslim sentiment and rhetoric associated the ISIL growth and expansion, and with Muslim terrorism around Europe and here, don't we also have the obligation to stand up and say, not in our name, we are also against it. The biggest number of victims of ISIL are actually Muslim. And you know what? I have a lot of people that, and a lot of friends that say, we don't see the Muslim community saying that. We don't see them fighting back.
But I have to stop you there.
Yeah.
Because they are saying it
Yes.
1,000 times a year, okay? I could literally send you a link of a compilation of how many Muslim condemnations of terrorism have been issued by every single Muslim authority internationally, nationally, every Muslim organization. Every time there's an attack, all we do is condemn, and nobody's listening to it, nobody cares. Okay? This is the truth. I'm not saying we shouldn't take, I do say we take, no, not possibly, it's documented, this is reality. I'm talking about a document that, it's called, oh goodness, I can't remember the website, but this woman, her name is Sheila Musaji, she's documented since 9/11, every single condemnation made by a Muslim organization. Tahir al-Qadri is a Muslim scholar from Pakistan, wrote a 600-page fatwa against terrorism years ago. It is constantly ongoing, and it's ongoing because of what you said, because most victims of terrorism are Muslim. So they're either busy dying or they're busy condemning, okay? But nobody's really paying attention. We are still the boogeyman. We get hurt from either side. And the reason that's happening is exactly what you pointed out, though, because we are very poorly organized.
Let me,
We are very poorly organized.
let me add something to, first of all, civil rights has been one of my main activities for my entire adult life. And I'm heavily involved in an organization of imams and rabbis in the greater Washington area. And I've been advocating for us to take a much stronger stand, a much more consistent and giving these immediate responses wherever the ugliness and the hate speech comes up. But the group is still feeling each other out. And this has been going on for 2 or 3 years. Still feeling each other out and wanting to spend time talking about the things that unite us, learning about each other's faith and that kind of thing. And I've been an activist for over 50 years. And so I don't dance around like that. I don't dance around the issues. But I think you're right. I don't say that there aren't all these proclamations being made, but in terms of what is being said where and reaching whom,
Exactly.
that's for me much more critical. And it ain't happening the way it needs to be happening. And this group that I'm a part of, and I'm yelling about it and cajoling about it, trying to, and we're talking like 50, 60 rabbis and imams in greater Washington, just greater Washington. So hopefully it will change course and it'll start becoming more vital and relevant to what's going on at the moment.
Or it may not, because if it is repeated continuously,
But-
as you said, and it is not producing a good result, this may not be the strategy.
But here's my question, what is the result you want it to produce? Is the result, it's not gonna, no matter how many times I condemn ISIS, they're not gonna care, they're gonna kill me anyways. Is the result that you want to lower anti-Muslim bigotry
No.
in the West? What is the result
I
you're
think that the
achieving?
legal action against, for example, very obvious big legal action against Donald Trump for using anti-Muslim
He
rhetoric.
hasn't broken the law.
Right, it's First Amendment.
Or something like boycott.
Look-
There's something that can be more hitting. I haven't seen one
Yeah,
big op-ed in
boycott.
the Washington Post. Was there one?
I will say there is media that's calling it out, but media is also enjoying it. This is
Yeah,
excellent. This is great for ratings. Every time it's outrageous, it's great for the media. They're eating it up. But our biggest, it's not, I don't want to say failure, I'll say it's a big challenge. Look, most Muslims in the United States come from immigrant backgrounds. I am maybe first, or like second generation, so I'm thinking about these things in a way that my parents didn't think about. They thought about sending their kids to school, getting, saving money, having retirement. They're not thinking about activism. My generation is, we are very immature and very young as an activist community. It will take a couple generations before we can figure out how do we take, and believe me, I mean, it's full of professionals, full of people with money. How do we turn that into influence? How do we make it political suicide to say these things, right? How do we do that? It's going to take us time to figure that out. We haven't figured that out yet. We still are, we don't even use like studies and focus groups and research yet to shape our messaging. Like we are very, very young in our activism and organization. It's going to take about 20, 30, 50 years.
Listen to me, please. I'm a founder, former executive director, and current board member of an organization called the Equal Rights Center. It's headquartered at DuPont Circle. We combat discrimination where the rubber meets the road, okay? And we stop it. So I'm not talking about somebody who's saying awful things but don't violate the law. I'm talking about discrimination against Muslims in employment, in housing, in public accommodations, in immigrant rights, in regard to immigrant rights, in national origin cases. And what I would like to have happen is that every Muslim in the greater Washington area and beyond knows that when something of that sort happens, you must contact a civil rights organization like ours, like the Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Urban Affairs, the Equal Rights Center, and others to take the legal action that will stop it, correct it, and get remedies for it for the victims. And that's not happening the way that it needs to happen.
I think this question has so many answers, and I think there are so many variables. And I want to touch on your unity and the questions that you had about this and disunity and multiculturalism. But we are, almost 25 minutes past the hour. So I guess we can continue our questions with our guests afterwards. But if you'll join me in thanking them for taking their time with us this evening. Thank you.